October 15th, 1943. Baltimore, Maryland, Patterson Park neighborhood. In the basement of a brick row house on Eastern Avenue, Detective Garrison Thorne of the Baltimore Police Department found 7 children's dresses, freshly pressed and hanging on a clothesline. Beside them stood 7 pairs of children's shoes, from tiny Mary Janes to scuffed saddle Oxfords, arranged by size. Everything was clean, well-maintained, as if waiting for their owners to return. But the owners would never return. And the woman who had sat on her front stoop for 11 years, smiling at neighbors and handing out ribbon candy to children, now sat silent in an interrogation room at Central District Headquarters. Silent, staring through the window where October rain washed the last color from the city streets. The story began one day earlier, October 14th, when 7-year-old Bea Calloway, called Bea by everyone on the block, disappeared. The girl left her apartment at 10 in the morning. Her mother, Loretta, had sent her to Klein's corner grocery for bread and milk. Bea was responsible, reliable for her age. At 7, she already knew how to shop, how much money to hand over, how to count change. Loretta worked as a bookkeeper at a shipping office on Thames Street, left at 9 each morning, came home at 7 each evening. Bea stayed with Mrs. Adeline Marsh next door, who watched several children from the building. But that day, Mrs. Marsh was bedridden, fever of 103 degrees, flat on her back with influenza. Loretta telephoned work to say she'd be an hour late, walked Bea down to the corner to make sure she knew the way, and then waited by the window. 1 hour passed. 2 hours. 3 hours. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Loretta ran to find the beat cop. Officer Wendell Carmichael, a 52-year-old man, heavy-set and methodical, listened calmly to her frantic story. Children rarely vanished in Patterson Park, but it happened from time to time. Usually they turned up within hours, gotten distracted somewhere, lost track of time, wandered a few blocks too far. He went door to door asking questions. First, he questioned Aunt Nell, Eudora Nelson, who'd sat on her stoop by the 3rd row house for 11 years, since spring of 1932. She was always there, summer from dawn to dusk, winter for 3 or 4 hours, bundled in shawls and an old wool coat. She knew everyone, remembered everything, saw everyone who entered or left the 3 row houses on her block and the 2 adjacent buildings. "Miss Eudora, did you see Bea Calloway this morning?" the officer asked. "I did, Officer Carmichael," Aunt Nell answered. She was 63 years old, face deeply lined from decades of sun and weather, eyes gray and watchful. She always kept her hands folded in her lap, one atop the other, in a gesture that seemed almost prayerful. Around 10 o'clock she came by, with her mother. They were in a hurry, heading somewhere. I figured they were going visiting, maybe to see relatives across town. "With her mother?" Carmichael repeated carefully. "You're absolutely certain?" "Absolutely certain, officer. Loretta was there, wearing that blue dress she wears on Sundays, and Bea beside her, holding hands. They were heading toward the streetcar stop on Eastern Avenue." The officer thanked her politely and continued his rounds. He questioned 5 more neighbors up and down the block. Nobody else had seen Bea except the grocer. Old Mr. Klein confirmed the girl had come in around 10:15, bought a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk, paid with correct change, and left through the front door. After that, the trail went completely cold. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Carmichael returned to Loretta Calloway's apartment. He asked her about the blue dress that Eudora Nelson had mentioned. "What blue dress?" Loretta looked at him in confusion. "I don't own a blue dress, officer. I've never owned one. And I was at work this morning, 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock, sitting at my desk in full view of 10 other people. I told you, Bea went to the store alone. That was the whole point. I had to get to work." The officer felt a chill run down his spine. He walked back to Eudora Nelson's stoop with deliberate steps. She sat in her usual spot, knitting something from gray wool, the picture of harmless elderly domesticity. Quote 8. Quote 9. Quote 10. The elderly woman paused, her knitting needles going still in her weathered hands. Eudora tilted her head thoughtfully. Carmichael felt the ground shift beneath the case. A missing child, a witness who claimed to have seen her with a woman, but not her actual mother. By evening, the Detective Bureau had become involved. The case was assigned to Detective Garrison Thorne, 38 years old, lean and taciturn, with a neat mustache and penetrating dark eyes. He'd worked in homicide and missing persons for 15 years, handled theft, assault, domestic violence cases. He'd searched for missing children twice before in his career. Both times found them alive and unharmed, returned to grateful families. But something about this particular case troubled him from the very start, set his instincts jangling. He began with systematic questioning of every resident in the building and the adjacent properties. 62 apartments in total, 193 people ranging from infants to the elderly. He interviewed families until midnight, took a few hours of restless sleep, then resumed at dawn on October 15th. By noon, he'd assembled a deeply disturbing picture. 17 different people reported seeing Bea Calloway that morning, some in the hallway of her building, some on the stairs, some in the courtyard below. All of them agreed on one crucial detail. The girl was alone, walking purposefully toward Klein's grocery store. No woman beside her, no adult accompanying her. Yet Eudora Nelson insisted otherwise, though her certainty seemed to waver and shift each time she was questioned. Thorne came to her stoop at noon on the 15th. She sat in her usual spot, knitting needles clicking with steady rhythm, creating something that might have been a scarf or a blanket. It was hard to tell. Quote 15. Quote, she greeted him with a warm smile. Quote 16. Quote 17. Quote, she set her knitting aside carefully, folded her hands in that characteristic way. Thorne nodded with apparent sympathy, but his investigator's mind was cataloging and cross-referencing every detail. He spent the afternoon systematically verifying facts about Eudora Nelson. Widow, 63 years old, lived alone in apartment 22 on the 3rd floor of the row house. No criminal record of any kind. Former seamstress who'd worked in the garment district until 1939, now retired on a small pension supplemented by some savings. Neighbors uniformly described her as kind, gentle, helpful, beloved by local children, to whom she often gave ribbon candy and sometimes cookies she baked herself. She'd lived on Eastern Avenue since 1931 with her husband Ralph Nelson, a steelworker at Bethlehem Steel who died suddenly of heart failure in March 1932. The couple had no children. By evening, Thorne had exhausted all conventional investigative leads. Search parties had combed every block in a 12-block radius. All local hospitals had been contacted and checked. Bus and train stations had been alerted. Shopkeepers questioned. Nothing. Beatrice Calloway had simply vanished into the October afternoon. Thorne returned to his desk at Central District, spreading his notes across the scarred wooden surface, when something caught his attention and wouldn't let go. Apartment 22, 3rd floor. Something about that detail nagged at him. He grabbed his coat and headed back to Eastern Avenue. It was 7:30 in the evening when he knocked on Eudora Nelson's door. She answered after a moment, surprised to see him standing there. She stepped aside, gesturing him into her apartment. The space was small but immaculate, lace doilies on every surface, porcelain figurines arranged on shelves, everything dusted and ordered with almost obsessive precision. The apartment felt frozen in time, like a museum exhibit of how people had lived decades earlier. Thorne moved slowly through the rooms with her permission, his trained eyes scanning for anything unusual. Living room with its ancient furniture, bedroom with a neatly made bed, kitchen so clean it barely looked used, bathroom with towels hung at perfect right angles. All seemingly normal. Almost too normal, too perfect. Then he opened the hall closet near the front door. Behind hanging winter coats and umbrellas, he noticed another door, partially concealed by the garments. Quote 28. Quote 29. Quote 30. Something flickered across her face, so quick Thorne almost missed it. Fear? Calculation? but her voice remained calm. Quote 31 __. She retrieved a key from a drawer in the kitchen, returned and unlocked the door to reveal narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness. She reached in and flicked a switch. A single hanging bulb illuminated a cramped, steep stairwell. Thorne descended carefully, one hand on the railing. At the bottom, he found another door. This one was locked as well. Quote 32. Quote. Her voice drifted down from above. Quote 33. Quote. Thorne's instincts sharpened to a fine point. I need you to find it. Right now, please. A long pause, then soft footsteps ascending. She returned a few minutes later with a small brass key, descended the stairs, and handed it to him without meeting his eyes. Thorne unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly. The smell hit him first. Damp, stale air with an undertone of something organic and wrong. Urine. Sickness. Fear. He pulled his flashlight from his coat pocket and swept the beam across the space. A storage room, perhaps 12 feet by 15. No windows. The walls were lined with old blankets and quilts, clearly hung to muffle sound. In one corner sat a small iron-frame cot with a thin mattress. On the cot lay a child. Bea Calloway. She was unconscious but breathing, her small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and dry. Beside the cot stood a wooden tray with food that had barely been touched, some bread, an apple, a glass of water. Thorne rushed to the girl, pressing 2 fingers against her neck to check her pulse. Weak but steady. He scooped her up carefully, her head lolling against his shoulder, and carried her up the stairs. Eudora Nelson stood in the hallway of her apartment, hands folded at her waist, face completely expressionless. Call for an ambulance immediately, Thorne ordered. And then, you're under arrest. At Johns Hopkins Hospital, doctors examined Bea Calloway thoroughly. Dehydrated, malnourished, suffering from traumatic shock and mild exposure. She'd been locked in that basement room for approximately 36 hours. With proper medical care, fluids, and nutrition, she would make a full physical recovery. Loretta Calloway sat beside her daughter's hospital bed, holding the small hand, weeping with profound relief and gratitude. Meanwhile, at Central District Headquarters, Eudora Nelson sat across a metal table from Detective Thorne in Interrogation Room 3. He'd brought her coffee in a chipped mug. She hadn't touched it, just stared at it as if uncertain what it was for. Miss Eudora, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. The truth. All of it. She looked up at him with those gray eyes, calm as still water. I took the child. I wanted to keep her as my daughter. Why would you do that? Because I've never been able to have children of my own. The doctors told me years ago. Something wrong with my womb. Ralph and I tried for years. Nothing ever took. After he died, the loneliness became unbearable. I needed a daughter. But Bea Calloway isn't your daughter, Miss Eudora. She could have been, if she'd stayed with me, if she'd accepted me as her mother. Thorne felt ice spreading through his chest and down into his stomach. Have you done this before? Taken other children? A faint, sad smile crossed her weathered face. Yes, Detective, I have. How many times? 7 times in total, including young Beatrice. Where are the other 6 children? They're in the basement too, in the other room. Would you like me to show you where? Detective Thorne returned to the row house on Eastern Avenue with 3 uniformed officers and Dr. Charles Feldman, the chief medical examiner. Eudora Nelson, now in handcuffs, guided them through the basement complex to a second room, deeper in the foundation, concealed behind stacked furniture and old steamer trunks. The door had been plastered over and painted to match the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside the hidden room, they found 6 burial sites. Shallow graves, each carefully marked with carved wooden markers bearing initials and years. E.S., 1932. R.M., 1935. UF, 1939. MH, 1940. RK, 1941. EW, 1942. The exhumation process took 2 full days, working carefully to preserve evidence and treat the remains with dignity. 6 small bodies, girls ranging in age from 5 to 9 years old. Medical examination revealed they had died from various illnesses: pneumonia, influenza, respiratory complications, tuberculosis. All showed clear signs of prolonged confinement and grossly inadequate medical care. No evidence of physical violence or sexual abuse, just profound neglect and the terrible consequences of captivity. Thorne spent the next week cross-referencing every missing children report filed in Baltimore over the past 11 years. 6 cases matched the initials and dates carved on those wooden markers. 6 families who had lost daughters and spent years never knowing what had happened, living in an agony of uncertainty. Elsie Schneider, 8 years old, disappeared in April 1932. Her parents, Marcus and Frida Schneider, reported her missing when she failed to return home from school one spring afternoon. Police conducted an extensive search. Neighbors organized search parties. Flyers were posted throughout the city. Nothing was ever found. Ruth Morrison, 7 years old, vanished in June 1935. Her parents, Victor and Lillian Morrison, last saw her playing in the courtyard behind their building on a warm summer evening. One moment she was there, visible from their window. The next moment, gone. They searched frantically for months before grief and mutual blame destroyed their marriage. They eventually moved to separate cities. Una Fitzgerald, 6 years old, disappeared in September 1938. Her parents, Paul and Vera Fitzgerald, hired 3 different private investigators over the course of a year, offered substantial rewards for information. Finally, after exhausting their savings and their hope, they held a memorial service for their missing child and tried to move forward with shattered lives. Maud Harrison, 9 years old, went missing in March 1940. Her parents, Nathaniel and Zoe Harrison, organized massive community searches, pressured police for daily updates, founded a citizens' advocacy group dedicated to finding missing children and supporting their families through the ordeal. Ruth Klein, 8 years old, vanished in August 1941. Her parents, Frank and Hope Klein, couldn't bear to remain in Baltimore after 6 months of fruitless searching. They moved to Philadelphia, seeking distance from the memories and the constant reminders of their loss. Eunice Winters, 5 years old, disappeared in February 1942. Her parents, Andrew and Teresa Winters, held a memorial service after a year of searching, erected a small monument in Greenmount Cemetery, tried desperately to conceive another child to fill the void. They never succeeded. And Beatrice Calloway, October 1943. The only one found in time, the only survivor. In lengthy, methodical interrogations over the course of 2 weeks, Eudora Nelson described each case in disturbing detail. She spoke calmly, without apparent emotion, as if reciting a recipe or describing her morning routine. I observed Elsie Schneider for several weeks. She walked home from school alone every day, took the same route. One afternoon in April, I approached her on the street, told her I had an urgent message from her mother, that there had been an accident and I needed to bring her to the hospital immediately. She trusted me. I'd always been kind to the neighborhood children, given them candy, smiled at them. She came with me willingly, without resistance. I brought her directly to my apartment, then down to the basement room I'd prepared. I provided 3 meals a day, clean clothes, read her stories at bedtime. She cried a great deal at first, begged to go home. I explained that this was her home now, that I would take better care of her than anyone else could. After about 2 weeks, she developed a severe cough, then fever. I gave her aspirin, kept her warm with extra blankets, tried every remedy I knew. It wasn't enough. She died on May 2nd. I buried her in the basement with respect and mourning. The pattern repeated with horrifying consistency. Ruth Morrison approached in the courtyard with a fabricated story about puppies in the basement. Una Fitzgerald lured with promises of a kitten that needed a home. Maud Harrison told her mother was waiting at Eudora's apartment with a surprise. Ruth Klein informed there was a telephone call from her father. Eunice Winters asked to help carry groceries upstairs. Different pretexts, same result. Trust exploited, child taken, confinement begun. Each girl was provided with regular meals, clean clothing, bedtime stories, all the superficial trappings of care. But the basement room had no windows, no sunlight, inadequate ventilation. The isolation and confinement invariably led to physical illness and psychological deterioration. Without proper medical treatment, fresh air, or emotional support beyond their captor's delusional version of motherhood, each child weakened progressively and eventually died. "Why didn't you stop after the first death?" Thorne demanded during one interrogation session, barely controlling his anger. "Why continue this pattern when you knew it was killing them?" Eudora looked at him with what seemed like genuine confusion. "Because the need didn't end when the child died. I mourned each loss deeply, Detective. Each death broke my heart. But eventually, after some months, the longing for a daughter would return. The loneliness would become unbearable again. So I would begin looking for another child who needed a proper mother." "You were killing them. Don't you understand that?" "I was trying to love them and care for them properly. Their deaths were tragic accidents, illnesses I couldn't prevent despite my best efforts. I never intended for any of them to die." Thorne stared at her in horrified disbelief, realizing she genuinely believed every word. In her profoundly distorted understanding of reality, she had been a devoted mother suffering through a series of terrible, unlucky losses, not a kidnapper creating the exact conditions that caused those deaths. Psychiatric evaluation was ordered by the court. Dr. Lawrence Pemberton, a specialist in criminal psychology, conducted extensive interviews with Eudora over the course of 3 weeks. His final report ran to 47 pages, but the core findings were clear and disturbing. Subject demonstrates severe pathological fixation on motherhood, almost certainly stemming from her own profoundly isolated childhood and documented inability to conceive children. She has constructed an elaborate delusional framework wherein kidnapped children become willing daughters who genuinely need her maternal care. She appears cognitively incapable of processing the reality that confinement itself causes the deaths. Instead, she rationalizes each loss as illness or bad fortune entirely beyond her control. While legally competent to stand trial and understand the charges against her, she is psychologically fractured in ways that prevent genuine comprehension of her crime's true nature. Background investigation revealed the deep roots of Eudora's obsession. Born Eudora Talbot in 1880 in Philadelphia, her father, a dock worker, died in an industrial accident when she was 3 years old. Her mother worked 14-hour days as a laundress to keep them fed and housed. Young Eudora spent most of her childhood locked alone in their cramped tenement apartment for safety. 12, sometimes 14 hours at a stretch, with nothing to do but stare out the window and watch other children playing in the streets below. She attended school sporadically, perhaps 2 or 3 years total. At age 14, she began working in a textile mill, operating dangerous machinery for pennies a day. At 26, she married Ralph Nelson, a steelworker 15 years her senior. They tried desperately for children. Doctor after doctor told them the same thing. Eudora's uterus was malformed from birth, conception was highly unlikely, and even if it occurred, carrying to term would be nearly impossible. Ralph eventually accepted this cruel reality. Eudora never did. She wanted desperately what she herself had never truly experienced: a child to nurture and protect and love properly, to give the childhood she'd been denied. After Ralph died suddenly in March 1932, massive heart attack, dead before the ambulance arrived, the obsession intensified dramatically. No husband to restrain her impulses, no one to question her behavior or whereabouts. Within 6 weeks, she had taken Elsie Schneider. The girl died after 3 weeks of confinement. Eudora grieved genuinely, mourned for months, then began watching for another suitable child. The intervals between kidnappings varied, sometimes years, sometimes months, but the compulsion always returned, always demanded satisfaction. The trial opened in January 1944 at Baltimore City Circuit Court. Prosecutor Dalton Hughes presented overwhelming evidence: the bodies, detailed medical examiner reports, Eudora's own extensive confessions recorded and transcribed. The case was horrifyingly straightforward. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Morris Greenfield, could only argue diminished capacity. Their client was severely mentally ill, driven by psychological forces entirely beyond rational control, unable to fully comprehend the criminal nature of her actions. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all 7 counts: 6 charges of kidnapping resulting in death, 1 charge of kidnapping. The courtroom was packed with families of the victims, journalists, curious citizens. When the verdicts were read, several family members broke down sobbing. Judge Walter Cunningham sentenced Eudora Nelson to death by electrocution. The execution date was set for June 1944. However, Governor Herbert O'Connor commuted the sentence to life imprisonment without possibility of parole after reviewing psychiatric testimony and considering that the defendant, while legally sane, was clearly suffering from profound mental illness. She was transferred to the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women in Jessup in February 1944. The notification of families proceeded gradually over several months. Each family's reaction was unique, but all were devastating in their own way. Marcus and Frida Schneider received notification in December 1943 that their daughter Elsie's body had been found. She had been missing for 11 years. They had already mourned, held a memorial service, tried to move forward. Then came the letter from Baltimore Police Department, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Marcus began drinking heavily, trying to numb the unbearable knowledge that Elsie had been suffering so close by while he'd searched in vain. He died in a car accident in 1945. Frida withdrew into profound depression, stopped eating, stopped engaging with life. She died in a sanitarium in 1948. Victor and Lillian Morrison had divorced shortly after Ruth's disappearance in 1935. Victor blamed Lillian for not watching carefully enough. Lillian blamed Victor for failing to protect their child. The marriage disintegrated in mutual recrimination. When police notified them separately in 1943 that Ruth's body had been found, they met for the first time in 8 years at the morgue for identification. They stood over their daughter's small remains, not looking at each other, not speaking. Then, they parted ways. They never spoke again. Paul and Vera Fitzgerald, after Una vanished in 1938, eventually had another daughter. They named her Una as well, trying somehow to replace what they'd lost. They raised the second Una in constant, suffocating fear, never letting her out of their sight for a moment. When police found the first Una's body in 1943 and notified them, they immediately took the second Una, packed everything they owned, and left Baltimore with no forwarding address. Thorne tried to locate them to return the first Una's remains for proper burial. No trail existed. The family had vanished completely. The first Una's body was eventually interred in Potter's Field. Nathaniel and Zoe Harrison, after Maud disappeared in 1940, had founded the Children's Guardian Society, dedicated to helping families of missing children and advocating for better police procedures. They'd poured their grief into activism, helping dozens of other families search for lost children. When Maud's body was found in 1943, they dissolved the organization immediately. Nathaniel told a reporter, _quote_56__. Frank and Hope Klein had relocated to Philadelphia after Ruth's disappearance in 1941. They couldn't bear staying in Baltimore, surrounded by memories and places that reminded them of their daughter. Police notification reached them by mail. They didn't come to Baltimore to identify the body. They requested that Ruth be buried near their new home and asked that the transport be handled without their presence. They couldn't face it. Andrew and Teresa Winters lost Eunice in February 1942. The wound was still raw and bleeding when police called in October 1943 to say her body had been found. They came to the morgue, identified their daughter's tiny remains, arranged for burial at Greenmount Cemetery. They erected a headstone that read, Eunice Marie Winters, beloved daughter, stolen from us. Heaven holds her now. They visited the grave every single week for the rest of their lives. Teresa died of a heart attack in 1951, only 42 years old. Andrew followed in 1953, cirrhosis from years of drinking to numb the pain. 7 families, 6 lives utterly destroyed by grief and knowledge too terrible to bear. 1. The Calloways, spared the worst outcome but forever marked. Beatrice Calloway's recovery was slow and uneven. Physically, she healed within several weeks. The doctors at Johns Hopkins were excellent. The care was proper. But psychologically, the damage ran much deeper than anyone initially understood. She experienced intense, recurring nightmares, the same dream almost every night for years. A small, dark room with blanketed walls, the sound of footsteps overhead, Aunt Nell's voice singing lullabies through a locked door. She developed severe claustrophobia, panic attacks in enclosed spaces. She couldn't tolerate basements under any circumstances, even with other people present. If a door closed behind her and she heard the latch click, her heart would race and she'd struggle to breathe. The sight of elderly women sitting alone triggered visceral, irrational fear. If she saw a grandmother on a porch or an old woman on a park bench, something primal in her brain screamed, "Danger!" And she'd have to cross the street, avert her eyes, force herself to keep walking. Loretta understood, or tried to. She took extended leave from her bookkeeping job, stayed home for 6 months to provide constant reassurance and establish new routines. Slowly, carefully, with infinite patience, Bea found her way back to something resembling normal childhood. She returned to school in January 1944, 3 months after her ordeal. Her teacher was briefed. Her classmates were told nothing specific, just that Bea had been sick and was returning. On the surface, by mid-1944, she appeared to be a regular 7-year-old girl again. But underneath, damage remained that would never fully heal. In prison, Eudora Nelson remained consistently quiet, obedient, and compliant. She worked in the prison laundry, folding sheets and pressing uniforms, meeting all production quotas without complaint. She followed every regulation, caused no disruptions, never argued with guards or other inmates. Other prisoners avoided her instinctively. Everyone knew what she'd done, why she was there. Child killers were despised even in that brutal environment, sometimes attacked. But Eudora seemed entirely indifferent to the isolation and the hatred. She did her assigned work, ate her meals alone, sat in her cell during free time, gazing through the small barred window at the world beyond. What thoughts occupied her mind during those long hours, no one could say or guess. Once, in 1947, a cellmate named Ruby Tate, a young woman serving 5 years for check fraud, worked up the courage to ask, "Miss Eudora, don't you feel terrible guilt about those little girls? Don't you lie awake at night thinking about what you did to them?" Eudora's response was chilling in its utter simplicity and complete lack of insight. Ruby stared at her in disbelief. Ruby Tate never raised the subject again. She requested a cell transfer the following week. Detective Garrison Thorne carried the weight of the Nelson case for the remainder of his career. He'd found Beatrice Calloway alive. That was one genuine success. 1 child saved. But 6 others dead. 6 failures, even though they died years before he'd taken the case, before he'd even known they existed. The mathematics of it haunted him. He'd saved 1 and found 6 corpses. The balance felt wrong, incomplete, insufficient. He retired from Baltimore Police Department in 1955 at age 50, moved to Annapolis with his wife, tried to forget his decades of casework and build a quiet life. But October always brought the memories flooding back. The smell of that basement, the sight of those tiny bodies, Eudora's calm, matter-of-fact confessions. He died in 1967, a veteran of 25 years of police work, still haunted by what he'd found in that basement on Eastern Avenue. On a frigid January morning in 1954, Eudora Nelson woke in her prison cell, attempted to rise from her bunk, and collapsed. left side completely paralyzed, face drooping, speech slurred and incomprehensible. Massive stroke. Prison guards found her on the floor and called for medical assistance. They transferred her to the prison infirmary, where she lay unconscious for 3 days, barely breathing, hovering between life and death. On the 4th day, she opened her eyes briefly. A prison nurse, a kind woman named Helen, who'd always treated even the worst criminals with basic human dignity, offered her water from a small cup. Eudora drank weakly, looked toward the barred window where pale winter sky showed gray and distant, and whispered in a voice barely audible, __quote_62__. Then she closed her eyes and died, 74 years old. They buried her in the prison cemetery, a bleak field behind the main buildings where indigent prisoners were interred. No headstone, no marker, just a small numbered metal plate driven into the hard ground. No one attended the burial. No relatives, no friends, no mourners of any kind. Just 2 prison guards fulfilling their duty and a single orderly who helped lower the plain pine coffin into the frozen earth. The story ended, but memory persisted, rippling outward through years and decades. Bea Calloway grew up, graduated from high school in 1954, attended secretarial school, became a teacher at a small elementary school in Baltimore. She married Harold Marshall in 1959, a kind accountant who knew about her past and loved her anyway, who understood when she woke screaming from nightmares and never demanded explanation. They had 3 children together, 2 daughters and a son. She built a full, productive, meaningful life. Taught 2nd grade for 30 years, touched hundreds of young lives, retired with honor and pension. But every single October 14th for the rest of her life, she woke from the same nightmare. A small, dark room with fabric-covered walls, the sound of footsteps overhead, the click of a key in a lock, and Aunt Nell's voice whispering through the door. "You're my girl now, my sweet, good girl. You'll be happy here with me." In 1973, exactly 30 years after her ordeal, Beatrice, now 40 years old, married with teenage children, decided she needed to return to Eastern Avenue one final time. She needed to face it, to prove to herself that it had no power over her anymore. She drove to Baltimore, parked near the old neighborhood, walked to the row house where it had all happened. She stood on the sidewalk, looking up. The building was still there, but converted now to apartments, modernized, different. The stoop where Eudora had sat for 11 years was gone, replaced by a small fenced yard with scraggly grass. Beatrice looked up at the 3rd-floor windows where apartment 22 had been, stood absolutely still for 60 seconds, counting her heartbeats, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Then she turned deliberately and walked back to her car. She drove home and never returned. But she'd faced it. She'd gone back. That mattered somehow. Yet even after that, sometimes when she walked past an elderly woman sitting on a porch or a bench, her heart would clench involuntarily. Her breath would catch. She'd quicken her pace, avert her eyes, and continue walking, determined not to look back, not to let the fear win. The case became a subject of academic study and analysis. Criminology students at Johns Hopkins and University of Maryland examined it as a textbook example of pathological maternal obsession manifesting in serial criminal behavior. Eudora Nelson appeared in forensic psychology textbooks published in the 1950s and 1960s as a case study illustrating how severe mental illness can coexist with legal sanity and produce horrifying results. Researchers analyzed her childhood, her marriage, her methods, debated whether she was evil or sick or some combination. But those who had lived through it, the families, the neighbors, the investigators, needed no academic frameworks or theoretical analysis. They understood exactly what she was. A predator who had hidden behind a perfect mask of harmless elderly domesticity. A killer whose weapon was false maternal love and forced captivity. A monster who looked like everyone's beloved aunt. The row house on Eastern Avenue where the crimes occurred was demolished in 1962. Urban renewal cleared that entire block. The basement where 6 children died was filled with construction rubble, buried under layers of concrete and steel and new development. No memorial marks the location. No plaque acknowledges what happened there. It's a parking garage now, unremarkable and anonymous. But in the Baltimore Police Department archives, the Nelson case file remains, stored in a climate-controlled vault. New detectives in training still study it, learning the crucial lesson that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. In psychiatric literature, her name appears alongside other historical examples of severe maternal fixation disorders. In the fading memories of those who lived through those years, fewer and fewer now, most dead or very old, the horror remains vivid and immediate. And in the mind of Bea Calloway Marshall, now 87 years old as of this writing in 2023, a resident of Sunrise Senior Living in Arlington, Virginia, great-grandmother to 7 beautiful children, the memory persists with absolute clarity. She survived. She built a genuinely good life. She helped hundreds of children through her teaching career. She loved and was loved. But she never entirely escaped that dark room. Those 36 hours of terror. The sound of Eudora's footsteps overhead. The singing. The promises that everything would be wonderful and happy if Bea would just stop crying, just accept her new home, just surrender to being someone's stolen daughter. Bea never accepted. She endured. She survived. But survival and true freedom are not the same thing. Because that's the fundamental truth about such crimes. They don't end when the perpetrator is caught, tried, convicted, imprisoned, or dies. They ripple outward indefinitely, touching everyone within their radius, leaving marks and scars that never fully heal. Eudora Nelson died alone in a prison infirmary in 1954, but her legacy lived on in trauma that couldn't be erased or forgotten, in families destroyed, in childhoods stolen, in trust shattered. The lesson, terrible in its clarity, is this: evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. It doesn't wear a monster's face or carry visible weapons. Sometimes it sits on sunny stoops in pleasant neighborhoods, knitting and smiling, offering ribbon candy to children with genuine warmth. It looks like everyone's beloved aunt or grandmother. It presents as harmless and kind right up until the moment it reveals its true nature. Until the door locks and the darkness descends and understanding arrives far too late. October 15th, 1943. 7 dresses hanging on a basement clothesline. 7 pairs of shoes waiting for feet that would never fill them again. 6 shallow graves in a Baltimore cellar. 1 girl who lived long enough to tell the story. And 1 woman who died genuinely believing she had been a loving, devoted mother. The rain washed Baltimore clean that day, running in rivers down the gutters, clearing leaves and debris from the streets. But some stains don't wash away with water. Some horrors embed themselves permanently in stone and soil and the collective memory of a community. Patterson Park neighborhood learned the hardest possible lesson. Monsters are real. They walk among us, and they look exactly like us.